Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's getting harder and harder to get people from their coffees and snacks, but I still hope that people in the room will enjoy the last panel of the day, because this is also a very, very interesting topic that we are going to discuss. It's how to measure the performance of different chemical management systems, and it will be moderated by Eeva Leinala. Eeva, can I give the floor to you?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And we hope the last stragglers will come in from coffee, as we also hope to have a lot of audience participation with your questions and ideas for discussion among the panelists as well through the message board and through your verbal questions later. So, as was mentioned, our panel will be focusing on measuring the performance of different chemical management systems. So if you think about measuring performance, we measure performance in a lot of different capacities. You know, if we think about school, we were always being measured on our performance during different tests to see how we're doing. Employees have performance evaluations. Companies are evaluated on their performance, and they're used to look at different things. Are you meeting particular standards? Or are you meeting your objectives or your goals? Are you delivering what you promised to deliver? And if something's not on track, should something be changed? And so it's really a concept that we use in a lot of different facets of life. And then we're going to focus in today very much on chemicals management and how are we doing with measuring the performance of our different chemical management systems. So if you think about it, of course, so there are country-specific programs. So you have your risk assessment and your risk management. You might put into place a risk management measure. But what did you actually achieve? Are you better managing those chemicals? And are we reaching the end goals of those programs? But also, as we'll hear about in our panel, it's not just in the context of regulatory chemicals management that we need to think about this, but also industries, both upstream all the way down to the retail sector, have chemical management responsibilities. And so how are they doing in terms of chemical management, and what are the opportunities and ways that we can measure that type of chemicals management as well? So to introduce our panel, we have Elena Montani from DG Environment in the European Commission. Next to her is Mike Schade from Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families in the US. Then we have from Canada, from Health Canada, and their Safe Environments Director, Daren Kelland. And then here next to me, Marco Camboni from Risk Policy Analysts, Europe. So really happy to be here today with all these panelists that are going to give you some different perspectives and ideas about measuring the performance of chemical management systems. And some of the points that we want to discuss are why is it important to measure our performance in chemicals management? What are some of the key indicators or outputs or things that we can use to see if we are being successful? What are some of the challenges with measuring performance? And then also this concept of linking better linking performance measurement with costs of inaction to demonstrate the value for many of chemicals management programs. So that's in a nutshell what the panel will focus on this afternoon. So as with the other panels, each of the speakers will have 10 minutes to give you some of their thoughts and reflections, and then we'll have a panel discussion and open it up for your questions and input as well. So we'd like to start off today with Mike Schade from Mind the Store campaign, the Safer Chemicals and Healthy Families. And his presentation will really focus on looking at the retail sector and opportunities to measure chemical management performance in this sector. So Mike, please go ahead.
Terrific. Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? So my name is Mike Schade. I coordinate the Mind the Store campaign for Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. and really excited to be here today to share a U.S. NGO perspective on chemicals management. I think I'm one of the few folks from the U.S. here, so really excited to represent us. So we launched the Mind the Store campaign 6 years ago to encourage and challenge the nation's largest retailers to get tough on toxic chemicals. We think that retailers can play a really important role in using their market power and influence to drive the reduction and elimination of chemicals of high concern across global supply chains, and also at the same time promote greater ingredient transparency by developing robust, comprehensive, safer chemicals management systems. And one of the ways in which we have attempted to promote improvement in the retail sector over the past couple of years has been to put out an annual report card that benchmarks retailers on their chemical policies or lack thereof, which is what I'll be talking about in my remarks today. So with the campaign, with our interest in really aiming to drive a competitive race to the top in the retail sector, we found that it's been an effective strategy to put out this annual report card that compares and contrasts the largest U.S. retailers by sales as a way to lift up the leaders and then call out the laggards and encourage the laggards to improve. The first report card was put out in 2016, 2.5 years ago, where we evaluated the chemical policies of 11 of the largest U.S. retailers by sales. And you'll see here some of the companies at the time got decent scores, with Walmart and Target coming in at top. But sadly, many companies with pretty poor grades, with grades of D and F. And of course, no one wants to get an F grade. I know I never did growing up as a student. So by calling out the laggards, we're really aiming again to create this competitive race to the top. And this headline that you see here in this Bloomberg news story at the time is really emblematic of the type of dynamic that we're aiming to create in the retail sector. This was a story from Bloomberg News, obviously a very popular business publication, and the headline at the time was "Walmart is first, Amazon is worst" in new ranking on chemicals. And by creating this dichotomy between the retailers, this is really helping to incentivize and encourage the retailers to improve. For our report card, we publish it on an interactive, consumer-friendly website, which we launch every year just 1 month or 1 week before Black Friday, the beginning of the holiday shopping season. And we put it online on this interactive website, retailerreportcard.com, to make it easy for not only consumers, but also investors and members of the media, suppliers, retailers to understand how retailers compare and contrast and how they can improve their approach to chemicals management. So I encourage you all to check out the website, again, retailerreportcard.com. When we put out our first report card in 2016, we evaluated 11 major retailers, 11 of the largest in the US, including Walmart and Amazon. And recognizing that, sadly, change is slow in Washington with enacting and now enforcing TSCA reform, we really felt a need to amplify change in the retail marketplace. So over the past couple of years, we've continued to expand the report card. In 2017, we went from 11 retailers to 30. And this past year, we expanded it once again to 40 major US retailers, including companies for the first time ever that are not only in the US, but also based in Canada, expanding the geographic scope of the campaign and the report. And it's worth noting that we evaluate companies that are leaders in key market sectors, 12 key market sectors where chemicals of concern are commonly found. In apparel, in baby and children's products, cosmetics and beauty and personal care products, electronics, building materials, and other key sectors. And we think that these retailers, many of whom are publicly traded, we think can really play an important role in driving transformative change in their sectors. So I want to talk a little bit about our approach and how we actually go about measuring the performance of these companies' chemical management programs or lack thereof. So it's worth noting that in the spirit of transparency that we evaluate companies based on publicly available information, so information that they may have publicly available on their website, on their corporate social responsibility section of their website, their annual sustainability report. And the way that we evaluate companies is across 14 key metrics or criteria that we view as essential elements of a robust and comprehensive safer chemicals management and implementation program. And we've harmonized our criteria with the Chemical Footprint Project because we view the CFP, the Chemical Footprint Project, as an important tool in measuring success around chemicals management. And so we've done that really to send market signals on what the NGO community in the US views as essential elements of a comprehensive approach to safer chemicals management. For each one of these 14 criteria, we assign a certain number of points that we grade companies against, and then we have a letter grading system that we've created to compare the numerical score to make it easy for, again, consumers, investors, members of the media, retailers to understand which retailers are leading and which retailers are lagging. And it's worth noting that we also, when we grade companies, we not only just put this out, but we actually share our scores with companies in advance, not only in the spirit of transparency, but for two essential reasons. One, to give companies an opportunity to disclose information that may not yet be publicly available, but two, and perhaps more importantly, to provide a roadmap by which companies can improve. So by sharing with companies both the quantitative and qualitative evaluation of how they compare and contrast across our 14 metrics, they can see a clear roadmap on how they can improve their approach to chemicals management. You can go to our website at retailerreportcard.com to read more about our methodology and also download the criteria. I did want to highlight a couple of examples of some of the questions that we look at when we evaluate companies. Because of limited time, I'm not going to go into all of these. One of them is policy. Does a company have a robust safer chemicals management policy? Do they have a restricted substance list that goes beyond basic regulatory compliance, especially in the US, where sadly federal laws do not do sufficient job in safeguarding consumers and workers from toxic chemicals? Have retailers set clear quantifiable goals and metrics for reducing and eliminating chemicals of concern? Oversight, does the company have clear senior management and board level oversight for implementing and executing their safer chemicals program? Accountability, how does the company actually ensure that their suppliers are in compliance with their policy? Do they audit their suppliers? Do they require suppliers to conduct their own third-party testing? Does the retailer conduct its own independent third-party testing to assess whether or not suppliers are in compliance with the company's RSL or manufacturing RSL? Disclosure, which is critical. Does the retailer encourage or require suppliers to disclose chemical ingredients to the retailer, including things like generic ingredients like fragrance, which we think are critical for companies to understand, particularly for formulated products? Action, which is for us the most important metric. Has the company shown that they've actually had success over the past few years in driving the reduction and the elimination of chemicals of high concern? And are they publicly reporting on those metrics? Safer alternatives. Does the company have a program in place to evaluate the safety of alternatives using tools like the green screen? Transparency is another important one. Is the company's chemical management policy publicly available? Is the retailer encouraging or requiring suppliers to disclose ingredients to consumers on pack or online? And finally, the other two key criteria that we evaluate companies against are the chemical footprint. Do they participate in the Chemical Footprint Project? Do they disclose their chemical footprint as Walmart is doing? Do they have a program in place to encourage or require suppliers to sell products that meet credible third-party safer chemical standards, such as EPA Safer Choice and Cradle to Cradle? So those are our 9 key criteria that we evaluate companies against. There's 5 other extra credit, which I'm not going to go into because of lack in time, but I share all this because it really provides a useful framework for us to understand who are the leaders and who are the laggards in the retail sector. And again, you can go to our website to read our report to see an in-depth assessment on how these companies compare and contrast. And in closing, I just want to talk a little bit about the impact that this is having in driving positive change in the marketplace. Within 1 year of the first report card that we put out in 2017, 7 out of 11 major retailers that we evaluated within less than a year, for the first time ever, either announced brand new safer chemicals policies or significant improvements to their approach to chemicals management, calling for their suppliers to take action on key chemicals of high concern like flame retardants and phthalates and PFAS. So this is evident of the power of evaluating and publicly benchmarking companies. This is helping to drive a competitive race to the top in the US retail sector, and I think provides a model of the type of change that NGOs can play in driving positive change in the retail marketplace. Since our first report card has come out, we've continued to see retailers to step up. Since 2016, the average grade of those 11 retailers that we first evaluated has significantly improved. The average grade in 2016 was a D+. Now the average grade for those 11 companies is a C+, which isn't great, but still demonstrates significant improvement. And over the past year, between 2017 and 2018, 72% of retailers that we evaluated noted significant improvements to their approach on chemicals. And again, a number of retailers for the first time ever announced new safer chemical policies in response to the campaign. Most notably, Amazon, as one of the world's largest online retailers, announced a sweeping new chemicals policy, which we think could be a real game changer given Amazon's dominance in global supply chains. And finally, since then, we've continued to see how by publicly benchmarking these companies, it's continuing to drive improvements. So since last fall, since November of 2018, we've continued to see companies announce significant new steps to improve their approach to chemicals management, with companies like Lowe's and Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Amazon, Target, Walmart, Dollar Tree. All of these companies within the past 6-7 months have announced significant new programs to take action on key chemicals of high concern. So for example, Amazon this past fall became the 13th major US retailer to announce that they were banning the sale of methylene chloride and NMP-based paint removal products online globally, who combined with the other market commitments that we won in 2018 amounted to over 30,000 stores across the world that had committed to taking action on these chemicals. So this is all emblematic of the type of change that we're trying to achieve in the retail marketplace. And again, at a time when the US federal government is sadly not doing enough to adequately manage the risks of chemicals in consumer products and packaging, we think that the retailers in the United States and also globally in Europe and elsewhere can really play an important role in meeting the rising consumer demand for safer, healthier products, radical transparency. And I think for those of you that are in the room that are in industry, whether you're with brands, formulators, chemical manufacturers, I think all of you can really help play an important role in meeting those retail demands for safer and healthier products and transparency, and respond to the new normal that is today. We don't think that retail regulation is going away. In fact, it's only going to increase. And I think all of you in the room can really play an important role in helping retailers meet these chemical sustainability goals that they've been setting and will continue to set in the year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for starting off our panel with those perspectives on performance measurement within the retail sector and how, as you mentioned, can incentivize chemicals management, but also give a roadmap towards improvement and how you started to see some of this improvement. So we'll move to our next speaker now, Marco Camboni from RPA Europe. Marco.
Thank you, Eva. Good afternoon, everybody. I work for a policy advising consultancy, and our clients are the European Commission, the OECD, other national authorities. And they keep coming to us asking for methodologies to assess the benefits of their regulatory actions. So why is that so important to measure the performance of these actions? Well, first of all, chemical management programs can be costly. They can be costly for both authorities and industry. And chemical safety compete with other issues on limited resources. Governments have shrinking budgets all the time. So it could be quite difficult, can be quite difficult to get the attention of decision makers before the severe consequences of inactions are apparent. A second very good reason is that, first of all, you would like to see whether the benefits of the action outweigh the costs, but you also like to know whether that is the best action or there are other alternative actions that are more efficient, that can achieve the same results with less resources. A third reason is that once you invest so much money on something, on an action, well, you want to justify that money with some results. I started working in consultancy around 10 years ago, and my first project was actually on REACH. And it was actually run by Bjorn. And he came to us and told us, right, we fought so hard to implement the REACH regulation, this very ambitious regulation. What are the benefits? It was quite a difficult question to answer. Ideally, you would like to measure the impact of regulatory action. In this case, you would like to measure how many chemicals-related diseases have been avoided thanks to the regulatory action. Hopefully, you should be also able to measure how many environmental impacts have been avoided thanks to the regulation. Unfortunately, we were not able to find the right information at the time. So we thought about, okay, maybe we could define some indicators in terms of exposure. And you can define these type of indicators on, for example, concentrations of chemicals in human body tissues, in animal or plants, or you can define this concentration on environmental media, or maybe you can find information about the changes in emissions and releases to this environmental media. Failing that, you can try to define indicators on changes in production volume of certain chemicals. Another level of indicators, you can try to define indicators in terms of the deliverables of the regulation. So, for example, how many substances have been registered, how many substances are in the authorization list, how many restriction decisions have been taken. At the time, we were able to define this type of indicators, and our justification was, well, REACH is starting to work, to generate this new information only now. So, for example, we now know, at the time we knew that how many chemicals there were on the European market that were manufactured and imported above 1,000 tons per year. And we knew how many carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic substances were on the European market. And that was a quite precious information that wasn't available before. The Commission didn't give up. They didn't give up on us. And they asked the same question a couple of years later. And this time, they asked us to develop a system of indicators. Let's see what are the challenges with this type of indicators. Impact indicators, well, they can be quite costly. Gathering the data and generating the data is very resource intensive. You are dealing with a certain amount of complexity because health and environmental outcomes are the results of synergies of multiple factors. First of all, they are the results of the synergies of the REACH regulation, with the CLP regulation, and with all other pieces of legislation like occupational health and safety, for example. But they can also derive from changes in human behavior or in technological changes, for example. They are also quite difficult because it's difficult to attribute a causative factor for different type of diseases. It is possible to do it for short latency diseases. It's actually quite difficult to do it for long latency diseases. There is also a certain amount of lack of harmonized data. At the time, we were able to find data from 2 member states, but we were asked to measure the benefits at the European level. If we instead try to define indicators on chemicals exposure, well, the best measure of human chemicals exposure is human biomonitoring. However, human biomonitoring is currently possible only for around 200 chemical substances. And these are usually well-known substances, possibly banned since many years. Sometimes data trends are lacking, so it's quite difficult to see what has been the evolution. And comparing data between different labs and different years is actually also quite problematic. There are similar issues also in environmental monitoring, so trying to measure the concentration of chemicals in water, for example. There is an additional question: which chemicals should we monitoring? Are we going to monitor the same chemicals over 3, 4, 5 decades so that we can see how the regulation improved the situation? Or do we want actually to capture whether there are new chemicals that are causing other problems? If you instead try to define indicators at the level of the deliverables of the regulation, the problem is that they are quite remote proxies. And you also need to complement them with enforcement indicators. It's not enough to implement a regulation. You also want to see whether it is enforced properly in all member states. Now, I like to conclude with some ways forward. How can we deal with this, all these challenges? Well, we need to keep generating new information, and we need to keep harmonizing legislation, statistics, and testing programs. We need to keep generating new information because it is true that we are risk adverse, but I think we are more adverse to uncertainty. This morning, somebody said that the public does not understand risk assessment, and I'm not sure I entirely agree with this, because everybody does risk assessment every day in our life. It's just that some of us does it more consciously than others. But we do take decisions on the basis of a risk assessment. What we are not able to deal with very good is uncertainty. So we need information. We need to keep harmonizing legislation, statistics, and testing programs because there are huge cost savings to be realized there. And an example is, for example, the very recent report from the OECD that told us that through the sharing of testing programs, industry and authorities were able to save millions of euros per year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco, for your insights from your work that you've done on developing different indicators and also giving us a flavor of the different types of indicators that could be used and sort of their different level from the impact to all the way down to outputs of the program. But maybe the outputs of a program are easier to measure, but are maybe less meaningful than in terms of actually how well you're performing. We'll move next to Daren Kelland from Health Canada. Please, Daren.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eeva. And thank you to the Helsinki Chemicals Forum for having a Canadian representation to this panel. Happy to be here and happy to be in Helsinki for the first time. Beautiful city. Really enjoyed what I've seen so far and hope to have the opportunity to explore more of it. I work at Canada's health agency, Health Canada. I haven't been there very long, new to the position there. But before that, I was at our environment agency, still involved with the chemicals management plan, and the two departments work very closely together on this joint venture. In my current capacity, I work in performance measurement. And so today I'll just cover a bit of the chemicals management plan within the performance measurement perspective, cover the why and the how of what we're looking at, and then talk about some challenges and end with where we're going from there. So the chemicals management plan was kicked off in 2006. It addresses approximately 4,800 priority substances that were identified as a priority for risk assessment and ultimate risk management where some concerns are found. We're working towards our goal of addressing those 4,800 substances by 2020. And so far we're on track to address those by April of 2020. There was a recent Auditor General report published in the fall of last year that outlined that the government should be doing more to measure the effectiveness of actions taken on toxic substances, measure whether or not they're actually doing what the objectives are set out to do. In response, the health and environment agencies issued a joint statement essentially agreeing with the Auditor General and saying that, that we agree that more should be done and committed to establishing a strategy on performance measurement that will be published early next year, in the early part of 2020, and that would set the framework for a systematic long-term approach to measure effectiveness of toxic substances, or actions on those toxic substances. So why measure performance? We covered that a little bit on here, but ultimately we spent all this time, energy, and resources on preventative actions on these toxic substances and churning out assessment after assessment on 4,800 substances over so much time. But ultimately, at the end of the day, so what? What difference have we made? How have we improved the world? How have we continued to protect the health of Canadians and the environment? So it's not just good enough to pump out these actions. We are dealing with substances where concerns were identified, they're toxic substances, and actions are in place. Now we need to know, are we on the right track? So here, found a cartoon in the New Yorker. It's rare to find a performance measurement joke, but in this case I had to use it. It's a man visiting his friend in a hospital. He brought him a get well soon balloon, and now he's visiting him again later and asking if there was any improvement since he's brought the balloon. That's from Robert Layton of the New Yorker. So how do we do that? How do we ensure that our actions are meaningful and not just where we mean well? Well, it's about the information available. It's all about the data, as is a common theme that we've been hearing today throughout the sessions. The decisions are made with the information that we have. So getting that quality information and access to from information from a number of different perspectives on to be able to establish a baseline is critical, to know what is the world like pre-action, and then compare that information or that baseline in the future post-action to see how effective the actions have been. So that can be pretty straightforward if you've got a case with a specific substance engaged with a specific sector, and you can maybe the concerns are emissions to air, and we can track that over time. In other cases, we're dealing with ubiquitous substances that are found throughout the nation in a number of different products and a broad spectrum of sectors involved, and there might be many actions in place to address the concerns with those substances, and that kind of undertaking can be much more challenging. In other cases, the actions can be preventative, and we're just looking at how the actions that we've taken has diverted potential exposure concerns or products. That could be through recalls or notification that prevented the entrance of products that contain toxic substances, or some enforcement actions or compliance verification tests that ensures that things that are in commerce that shouldn't be are removed. But it's also looking broader, not just are these tools working, but ultimately how are we doing in terms of improving the health of Canadians and their environment. So we'll look at trends over time, recognizing the reality is chemicals management decisions are based with the best information available in a certain point in time, but the world is not static. It's dynamic, and the markets are dynamic. There's continuous improvements with chemical formulations, new products, new volumes, new industrial activities that might be occurring, emerging science, new studies. So we'll take a look at what the state of the environment and what we're finding with any available information and consider that as well. And trending information, maybe it's not good enough to know, okay, yes, we're still at levels of concentrations that we're comfortable with, but if we're starting to see an upward trend towards not okay, then maybe we need to take a closer look at what's going on. There could be non-market situations, of course, and influencers such as climate change. So going through this type of action with the performance measurement can help identify whether or not we need to establish new baselines considering this these dynamic influencers and seeing what are those critical needs that will be important to track into the future, and now committing to action plans to generate that information and engaging monitoring programs and new science. And it's fine if there's some course correction needed. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to ensure that we have ongoing relevance with the risk management actions, and one-size-fits-all approaches may need to be tailored with some specific tweaks or new actions required. Or it could be just a level of implementation issue. If you're seeing results that aren't favorable, it's important to also look at the implementation of the tools. It may not be the tool that's the issue. It just could be an implementation issue, and that more stakeholders need to be involved. Or perhaps voluntary isn't working and we need to issue some mandatory regulations to address the concerns. Some of the challenges we heard earlier, the data challenges for sure, the compatibility issues. I think there was a reference earlier about comparing apples to apples and not apples to sausages. I'd go one step further and say it's important to compare Granny Smith to Granny Smith, Red Delicious to Red Delicious. Sorry, these are specific types of commonly available apples in Canada. So what I mean is specific types of apples that you'd be comparing. So it's not just biomonitoring information, not even just concentrations within blood, but is it the specific age group of concern based on the concerns with the substance and the actions taken, for example. And it could be some technological advances with the methodologies. So if you're seeing some trends that plateau, let's say with emission reductions, but then in 2012, for example, things start to plateau, it's not necessarily that reductions have stopped. There could be other factors such as improvements with detection levels and the tools used to measure that information, and that in fact you are continuing to reduce the emissions, your ability to detect those emissions have increased. And some logistical challenges, of course, with the costs associated with the data generations and with a country as vast as Canada, you've got all kinds of different potential applications, and something that's nationally representative may not be representative of the concern, which might be more point source or in a specific geographical region. And I'll just end with some where do we go from here in the socioeconomic perspective. Certainly there's the obvious reduced cost to the healthcare system with reduced diseases and health incidents that occur. But we're also seeing emerging science with specific diseases that are caused by environmental contaminants. And this is something that we want to continue to keep an eye on and to work into our performance measurement work. And looking more broadly, not just for a substance-specific performance measurement, but the chemicals management plan as a whole, how is that contributing to improving the lives of Canadians and the cost savings associated with the improvements to healthcare. And of course, it's we talked earlier about the aligning of resources. These are public funds. As regulators, we want to ensure that we get the best bang for the buck. And if through the work of performance measurement, we're seeing that some strategies to address risks are not appropriate or not as effective as they could be, this exercise helps us inform whether or not we need to make any changes to our risk management toolbox. And just leave with the idea that it can minimize future costs. Of course, if you address concerns as you identify them earlier on and address them sooner rather than later, it can certainly help minimize future costs. It's a lot more challenging and expensive and difficult to clean up an issue years down the line rather than address concerns immediately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daren, for bringing forward the Canadian perspective and some of the thinking that's going on in Canada to respond also to the feedback from their Auditor General and how to improve the performance measurement and some of the challenges with that and data challenges and the logistical challenges. And then I think your last point is interesting too in terms of this proactive identification and how can you use performance measurement in that capacity as well to more proactively deal with an issue, given that in many of these cases we're dealing with legacy issues as well. So last but not least, I'd like welcome Elena Montani from DG Environment to share some of her perspectives on performance measurement. Elena.
Yes, hello everybody, good afternoon. So my name is Elena Montani and I work in the Chemicals unit in DG Environment in the European Commission. I've joined this unit last year, so I joined the Chemicals Magic World only last year, but I'm not new to the science policy debates. I was working before in DG Environment in a science policy unit, so I'm quite used to debates about measuring and about how the science can feed into policy. I'm sure a lot of you are very knowledgeable about REACH, and maybe a lot of you are knowledgeable about some specific pieces of chemicals legislation in the European Union. But I don't know how many of you are actually knowledgeable about the fact that there is a very complex EU legislative landscape about chemicals in the EU. And today I would like to make you do a little bit of a deep dive into it. So in 2015, we started an assessment of what we can call the EU legislative acquis, which is, as we will see a bit later, a very complex landscape. And why did we do it? Because we need to be accountable to the citizens. Basically, this is the main objective of a public body. We need to tell the citizens what we have done up to now and what has worked and what has worked less well. We need to identify where we can improve our legislation, and we need to identify where we need to radically change our legislation. The European Commission has a very strong interest in better regulation. There is a better regulation program which is evolving all the time, and the idea is that our legislation needs to be revised regularly. We have ex-ante impact assessments before proposing legislation, but we have also ex-post evaluations to see basically if the legislation is fit for purpose to current and future challenges. So that's how we started in 2015, so 4 years ago. But what was the scope of this assessment? It was a very, very broad scope. So depending on the criteria we use, we can find around 100 pieces of European legislation around chemicals. So you can see that you can imagine already how complex the interaction about these different pieces is. The scope, the legislation is very comprehensive in the sense that it covers from the labeling and of substances, the hazard identification, the production of substances, but also downstream legislation about downstream uses of chemicals, chemicals in products. We have cosmetics, food materials, food contact materials legislation, detergents legislation, but we have also a lot of legislation around environmental protection, specifically about some environmental compartments like water, soil, air. We have waste legislation, which obviously interacts with the chemicals legislation, as we've seen today in the circular economy discussions. This legislation is evolving all the time. The first piece of legislation was in '67, and it was about classification, packaging, and labeling, about trying to harmonize member states' standards. But during these 50 years of legislation, we had different pieces of legislation which emerged at different times and with different specific objectives. We can see 3 key objectives around the chemicals legislation, which are basically the single market, so promote single market and competitiveness and innovation, but also, of course, the protection of human health from hazardous chemicals and the protection of environment from hazardous chemicals. So the scope was very broad. We managed to reduce the overall assessment to only 41 pieces of legislation. And the focus was, so basically we refocused the entire exercise around the hazard assessment and risk management processes. And we tried to evaluate so the interaction in the legislation around those processes. So who was involved? The European Commission has clear guidelines on how to do evaluations, policy evaluations. And it also has a clear consultation map that we need to address. So our basic aim is try to make sure that we feed our evaluations with the most updated and relevant evidence. So of course we spent a lot of time with different studies. We tried also to use studies which were not specifically born because of these assessments. We tried to use also studies which were possibly also created within the specific assessment of specific pieces of legislation. So a lot of evidence was collected in this way, also to try to monetize, obviously, costs and benefits. At the same time, the opinion of citizens and stakeholders is very important for assessing the impact of legislation. And we had a European, so a EU-wide consultation, a EU-wide survey, which is the European Barometer, but we also had a European public consultation where citizens and stakeholders could say their view, and various workshops, and we involved experts. And as you can imagine, different services of the European Commission were involved, and I can assure you that this doesn't make things easier, because of course, even inside the Commission, you have very contrasting or sometimes very kind of difficult to put together missions. So we had a steering group with different services in the European Commission, also because this legislation is also scattered around different services in the Commission. The EU agencies were involved. So this is just to give you an idea of how many voices we heard around this process, which lasted 4 years, and how difficult it was at the end also to combine all the different views, which were sometimes very diverging, and also the scattered evidence, as we can see in a moment. So as you can expect, we encountered many challenges along the way. And we tried to find solutions. I put it within brackets because it was our solutions for this purpose. So I don't know if we can generalize the solutions as such, for every policy evaluation. This was a very specific policy evaluation. Probably there were not other similar ones in the Commission. The first challenge was that we were assessing a framework. So it was 41 pieces of legislation together. And not only that the framework was broad, but also that it was also limited in the way that we had excluded REACH, which obviously had clear links with the rest of the legislation, but there was a parallel process to evaluate REACH, which was adopted last year in the REACH review in 2018. So assessing this framework was, of course, the first challenge, and we tried to clarify the focus around this risk assessment and risk management processes, so at least to be clear on what we were assessing. So we were assessing the interactions between legislations and not how specific legislation was achieving its objectives. A big problem we had was that we had no baseline. There was no similar assessment done before, so of course there was no term of comparison on our assessment this time. And what we did was to use points of reference rather than a clear baseline. So for health and environmental protection, the measurement was done by monitoring or by measuring the reduction in exposure since the 70s. For the internal market, it was maybe a bit easier because we have a clear indicator to measure the growth in the intra-EU trade, which clearly shows that there is a positive progress there. We have also a Eurostat indicator, which is like the official indicators for chemicals production and consumption, which is also serving the monitoring for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is supposed to give us indications about how much substitution is happening. But there are a lot of limitations about this indicator, and also from our assessment, it was quite clear that this is not such an obvious indicator on how much substitution is actually happening, thanks to the chemicals legislation. We had a lot of data and knowledge and methodological gaps, as you can imagine. So the data was very scattered. We had also little data on enforcement and implementation of various pieces. There is very limited resources in member states to do surveillance activity, for example, and this proved to be a great limitation. And this is also linked to the fact that we had partial figures which allowed us to actually measure health and environmental benefits, and also to monetize benefits and costs. So it was quite unrealistic to come up with a cumulative figure of benefits and costs around of the overall framework, but we managed to calculate costs and benefits around some pieces of legislation or some single substances and the regulatory actions around those substances. The attribution challenge was also a key point for us. So how much are negative trends in health and environment telling us about how the policy measures are actually working or not? And this is linked to the fact that measures take time to have an impact which is measurable, and effects today could be the result of past exposure. So this is difficult to attribute to specific legislation today. And also, most negative trends have, of course, multi-causal factors, and this in the chemical sector is a big problem. The complexity of judging how much the chemicals is and a hazardous chemicals is producing a negative effect together with other lifestyle and genetics components. we had no quantified objectives. It's very difficult to say if you're protecting health and environment as such, if you don't have a quantified idea of how much is supposed to be. So there was a quantified objective in some pieces of legislation, but the overall framework, of course, it doesn't have a clear trend where we can compare if we have positive trend or not. And then obviously there were many diverging views around how positive or negative the impact was around different things. So on this we have tried to be very transparent and try to present the diverging opinions, also because sometimes the opinions are diverging because they are looking at different aspects, at different factors. There are different interests around chemicals legislation and chemicals impact. So what we found as lessons learned is be very transparent about your assumptions, be very transparent about your limitations, be very transparent around where there are divergences of opinion. Present what you have, present what is factual, but also present what is opinions, because also opinions are important when you are evaluating policies, because of course this is the personal judgment of the citizens or the stakeholders which are directly involved in everyday legislation. As a final comment, I feel to add, but I think there will be time for discussion on this. For sure we need additional research on a number of fields that maybe we can explore now. We need better indicators, and I'm happy that Marco is also involved in helping developing better indicators for the future. And we probably need, in some cases, some better assessment of specific pieces of legislation in order to complete the overall picture. If you want more information, here is our website, and I am also happy maybe to announce informally that this evaluation should be adopted by the Commission in the next weeks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Elena, for the presentation, and certainly you mentioned a lot of challenges with with measuring performance of such a large scope of different pieces of legislation, and we want an idea of how all these pieces are working together and their integration, but then it does provide for a lot of challenges in measuring the performance of them. So we're going to now have a panel discussion, and then we'll be opening it up to your questions and comments, so please think of those. Also within our panel, we've focused on the retail sector and then also the regulatory sector. But if you're also from maybe a different industry sector and you've been doing chemicals performance measurement within your company, then maybe that's also something that you could share with us during the discussion period. So just to start things off. So I think we heard in all the presentations reasons for the importance of measuring chemical management systems, whether they be government-driven or in the retail sector, how they can incentivize, how they can course correct. And at the same time, we heard about a lot of different challenges to measuring this performance. And one question I had is, if it is so important to do this, why is it still such an underdeveloped area that we're struggling with to do? I mean, there are some countries that are doing performance measurement, but many are not even attempting it. We heard about in the retail sector, but this is fairly new also in the last couple of years. So, why do you think it's so underdeveloped, and how can we help move it forward? Maybe Mike, we can start with you.
Yeah, this is on. Yes. No, I think that's a really fair question, and I don't know if I actually have the answer to that, but I will say that in the NGO community, pursuing report cards such as the one that we've been pursuing over the year is a tried and true practice that actually has demonstrated real and meaningful change in different sectors over the years on a range of sustainability issues. You know, in the US, going back to the late 1990s, report cards were used as a tool to encourage major home improvement and paper companies to move away from old growth and endangered forest wood and paper. On the chemicals side, you know, we were actually very much inspired by some of the report cards that our friends at Greenpeace International has pursued over the years. I think they have pioneered this approach in publicly benchmarking companies in different sectors around their approaches to chemicals management. You know, as evidence of that, you know, for a number of years they were running the Greenpeace Detox campaign, which was encouraging major apparel brands, particularly in Europe, to drive hazardous chemicals out of global apparel supply chains. And I think that has clearly shown to be a powerful approach to drive the reduction and elimination of chemicals of concern out of apparel. I mean, we now have so many major apparel brands that have since signed on to the ZDHC initiative to solve these issues, but it was really that report card that Greenpeace was doing for some time that I think really helped catalyze change in the apparel sector. The same was true for their work in electronics. They were running an electronics campaign for a number of years, and they were putting out an annual report benchmarking major apparel brands like Apple and HP and Dell and others, and that really helped drove many major apparel brands to set fairly robust goals to drive reduction of chemicals like brominated flame retardants, PVC plastic, and phthalates out of electronics. So I think, you know, we were very inspired and motivated by those past successes, which is what motivated us in part to create a report card for the US retail sector, because we wanted to kind of replicate that strategy as a way to drive change. And certainly I think that there are many other sectors that are out there where chemicals of concern that are commonly found, and I think there's an opportunity to take these model sectoral campaigns and report card approaches to challenge other sectors to improve. I mean, one that I've thought of that I think is untapped is the hotel sector, right? Here, you know, there's been little efforts, at least in the US, to engage major hotel chains around chemical sustainability, and obviously hotels use a lot of chemicals for cleaning products and building materials, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to kind of leverage this approach in other sectors. And then, you know, finally, I'll note that I think a new example of a quantitative and qualitative chemical assessment framework that has been developed in recent years in the US is the Chemical Footprint Project. How many of you have heard of the CFP as a tool? Some, not many. Well, hopefully we can change that, because that's you know, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the idea of measuring a carbon footprint or measuring a water footprint. So the Chemical Footprint Project is a new effort that was developed by advocates and consultants in the US to try to figure out how can companies measure their chemical footprint. And we're beginning to see companies like Walmart in the US, Target, and others begin to commit to evaluating their chemical footprint. And I think that could be a really useful tool that can help the business community identify where, you know, what are things that they're doing well, and also what are things that they can do to improve their approach to chemicals management, to identify gaps and pain points that need to be addressed to improve how companies address reducing and addressing their chemical footprint. So that's definitely a new tool that I encourage folks to check out and consider evaluating for your own company.
Yeah, so it seems that there was much more experience in the retail sector to build on, and that maybe the sectors can take some lessons from that. Maybe Daren, I'll go to you. I mean, this was one area that was flagged for Canada to improve on, sort of an underdeveloped area in the chemicals management plan. And so, you know, some of your reflections on, why is it that on the performance measurement side we're still sort of struggling in terms of in the regulatory context?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's probably a number of factors. Certainly the resource issue, based on what we've been talking about with the drive. So how are we measuring success? We've been pretty good so far at reporting on the number of assessments published, the number of substances that we've been looking at. But we have to sort of change that framing of how we measure success. I think production pressure is a big element as well, as we're trying to address a certain number of substances by a given time, and as we're pumping out risk assessments. And as we've heard, regardless of the jurisdiction, when an issue is identified, there's that duty and requirement in many cases to address that issue. So there's those other competing priorities that are definitely a factor. But we shouldn't ignore also that there's the inherent nature of the beast here, and that's with the time. As the reality is, many risk management instruments inherently require a significant passage of time where you would reasonably expect to see changes in the environment, in the body. So that's another element that's certainly for me has been frustrating. I'm a relatively impatient guy who wants to see results right away and trying to get actions right away, but it's just not reality. So certain cases, you just need to wait for the time to elapse to be able to see those changes. Another factor, which I hope is not the case, but could be in certain cases, maybe a fear of failure, depending on the case, just afraid of what you'll find when you start looking into it. But I hope that's not the case, because I certainly don't see it that way. I think where you identify an action or an operation where you have not met your targets, that's a success. It shows that there's a system in place to be able to identify these cases and adjust course where needed to be more effective, to be more efficient, and to ensure that you are going to reach those goals overall. I think we're starting to see a shift, certainly in Canada, with performance measurement. Obviously, there's the creation of my unit now, where we can finally have some time and space dedicated to performance measurement. And in our approaches that we're publishing now, moving forward in our risk management approaches, we'll have a dedicated section to explain how we're going to measure the performance of these actions moving forward. So I think moving forward, that's going to be more entrenched in our operations.
And Elena, maybe I'll go to you on the same question. And I think there's more experience to build on in the commission in terms of often having to evaluate different policies. But you spoke also about the number of challenges in this area. So maybe you can reflect on how we can get past some of those and move this area forward more broadly in terms of performance measurement.
Yeah, no, as you said, and as I mentioned already, in the Commission, I think we cannot say that we're not evaluating enough. I think the Better Regulation Program is very solid, and it requires really deep evaluations. We feel that now actually we know enough about how the chemicals framework work in the EU, and we are actually ready to move to the next step and to maybe take the follow-up actions. On the challenges, you were asking more specifically what were the challenges. I mentioned some of them. I think the biggest issue here is data, the scarcity of data, especially for some issues. And as I come from DG Environment, I would like to mention environment as a specific problem. We have much more data on health impact and less data on the environment. And most often legislation, chemicals legislation, when environmental protection is addresses the aquatic compartments. So everything which is not aquatic, so the soil and the biodiversity, the terrestrial biodiversity, is rarely assessed. We are missing really a lot of information on the impact of hazardous chemicals on the environment and biodiversity, on the ecosystem services, on the complexity of the impact and on the accumulation on the impact on the environment. So I think there we really need a lot more. It was mentioned already that we had a big project on human biomonitoring. Our idea is now to try to extend that to also cover environmental monitoring, so really to try to fill some of the knowledge gaps. But of course, this requires time and requires a lot of resources and investments.
And Marco, maybe linking into the EU discussion, I mean, you mentioned in your presentation, the challenges in starting to build some of these indicators, and so I mean, you're helping to develop this area. So some reflections on the struggle to do this and how we can improve.
Well, the problem that is not a problem, but just the reality is that the context is always changing. We have new chemicals on the market. And for example, in Europe, beyond the databases that are maintained by the Chemicals Agency, we also have, for example, the EPRTR, the Pollutant Releases and Transfer Register, where industrial facilities have to report releases, quantities to the environment above a certain threshold. There is a list of 90 chemicals that needs to be reported. Among them, for example, there are around 20-25 pesticides that are included in the Stockholm Convention. They've been heavily regulated since 20-30 years, some of them. And yes, you can see that there is a decline in releases, not surprisingly. But what do we want to do? Do we want to keep tracking these chemicals for how many years? Or do we want to include on the list new chemicals, other pesticides, for example, neonicotinoids that have been associated with decline in pollinators population around the world? And already neonicotinoids have been restricted for outdoor use. So maybe we should look at the new generation of pesticides, maybe. This is one of the problems. A second problem is that the drivers, the motivations are changing all the time. For example, now there is a switch from the chemicals legislation to the interface between the chemicals legislation, the product safety legislation, and the waste legislation. Do we need to, how do we regulate the information flow within the actors in the supply chain of products? Do we need to have a database where manufacturers will have to report the content of hazardous substances in articles, or and how this information will be used by the recyclers, or maybe there is other information that is more valuable for the recyclers, like where this waste is coming from and how it has been collected and sorted. So these are all the problems that are always changing.
Yeah, and I think this is a theme that's coming up with many of you, I think, is this scarcity of data. So maybe the methodologies are there, but then there's not the data available to apply them and then measure the performance. And then this idea of, if you're monitoring chemicals, you maybe have a set list or set number of resources that you can commit to that biomonitoring or monitoring. So which ones do you pick? Do you pick the legacy substances to see if they're continuing to decrease, or do you add new ones? And Mike, you were mentioning that you use the publicly available information to do the evaluation of the retail companies. And do you find that's similar challenge with you to be able to fill the different data points that you need to develop the report card?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we've found over the past couple of years is that since we've been putting out this annual report card, we put out our third one this past fall, it has definitely helped drive and encourage companies to be more transparent about their approach to chemicals management, which I think is a good thing because consumers, investors, they want to know how companies that they shop from are addressing dangerous chemicals in the products that they sell. And you know, I think the good news is that the more that we've engaged different large retailers in recent years, we have found, you know, a trend in that there are many companies that are doing really good work that they are not being transparent about. And so we've found that by publicly benchmarking companies, that has really helped improve how companies talk about their approaches to chemicals management. You know, for example, there's many companies that had beyond restricted substance lists in place that they had never disclosed before. So just by publicly evaluating companies, this has helped prompt some major US-based retailers. Costco is an example of one who, for years, had a pretty robust and extensive product testing program in place where they test their private brand products for chemicals of concern. And they just never spoke about it publicly. And after they received a fairly poor score in our first assessment, that has really helped encourage them and other companies to be more transparent about how they manage chemical risks in their supply chain. But for many other companies, either they don't have programs in place or they're anxious about or they either don't have programs in place or they're risk averse and nervous about sharing this information publicly. And then on the other hand, there are just many companies that are just not minding the store and not doing the work. You know, while I talked a lot about the positive end in terms of growing trend of US retailers that are stepping up and adopting robust and implementing robust safer chemical management programs, the sad truth is that far too many retailers in the US remain serious laggards. In our most recent assessment, we evaluated 40 major companies. You know, many of these companies have multi-billion dollars in sales on an annual basis. Sadly, 19 out of 40 companies received failing grades, and 12 out of 19 received 0 out of 135 possible points, which, you know, frankly is just shocking and quite pathetic in my view. So, you know, by publicly benchmarking their companies, we're not only hoping to encourage companies to be more transparent, but at the same time to really step up and meet this rise in consumer demand for safer and healthier products free of ingredients of concern, because this is a new normal that we operate in. And I think, you know, we hope that other NGOs and other regulators will take a close look at this model that we've pioneered in the US and think about how can this, you know, this effort to publicly benchmark companies could be replicated in other places. Like, it'd be great to have a Mind the Store retailer report card in Europe, for example, which we've had some conversations with EU NGOs about. So anyways, I'm kind of babbling a little bit, but those are some thoughts in response to your question.
All right, thanks for those reflections. And now I just wanted to switch to a slightly different topic. One area that we wanted to cover in the panel was also the links between performance measurement and cost of inaction. And one reason also that performance measurement is done is also to justify funding, for example, for chemical management programs, whether they be in companies or within countries. Why do we need to keep funding this? And I wanted to mention that at OECD, we recently started a project to improve the data inputs to economic evaluations for chemicals management. So this is through conducting coordinated willingness to pay surveys on an increased number of chemicals for different health points. And then these values for these surveys can feed into economic assessments. So we have these values for a number of chemicals, and so for example, for lead. So we have some OECD estimates that the welfare costs of premature deaths from exposure to lead was $1.7 trillion US in 2017 worldwide, and $374 billion US in 2017 in OECD countries alone. And this doesn't even include morbidity-related impacts, it's just mortality. So this is with one particular compound. And so these values are large even just for one chemical. And then yet chemical management programs continually have to justify their existence. And so, some reflections on, are these values, which are these huge numbers, are they helping? Or can you really use these global numbers, or do you have to sort of focus in on the particular risk management actions and the costs and the benefits of those actions? Because seemingly with these numbers, it should be self-justifiable to invest in chemicals management programs. And maybe we can start with Elena on this question.
I'd like to bring the systemic perspective to the debate. When I joined the chemicals world, I realized that very often we have a very single substance perspective. We just see things like either banning or not banning or restricting a bit. But I think chemicals is actually a systemic issue, and I'd like to call it actually a wicked problem. A wicked problem is a problem where many actors are involved, where when you have a solution of a problem, it actually triggers different solutions or problems in other sectors. It's when you have many trade-offs. We have here many trade-offs with socioeconomic aspects, and this is clearly something to take into account when we need to decide on risk management measures. We have a global component. There is the size and the scale of the production, and also the increasing trade between countries of chemicals is a key aspect to take into account. And we have an evolving context all the time. So I think that's what we have to take into account when we talk about risk management measures. We have to take into account that the issue is systemic, and it has to be addressed systemically. And then that's also why maybe one figure is not enough to maybe trigger risk management measures so easily. And that's also why maybe there are so many divergent views also when one figure seems so factual. So this is the perspective I would like to bring more complexity to the debate.
Marco, maybe some of your reflections on that same question, or following up also on the Elena's point of it's a systemic issue that we have to deal with, and it's not just one figure that can provide the incentive or the justification for continuing chemicals management programs.
Yes, indeed. I like to use one of the recent projects we were involved. We were asked to assist in drafting a guidance to measure the benefits of having regulatory regimes for the prevention, preparedness, and response to chemical accidents. Intuitively, everybody should have a regulatory regime to prevent such events. And I like to think that there is no country in the world with some chemical industry that does not have such a regulatory regime. The real question is always how much regulatory action you need on top of what you already have. And that's where you are always trying to measure the marginal benefit that you are trying to make.
Daren, some reflections?
Well, we've been pretty lucky in Canada so far with the last two administrations supporting chemicals management plans as a priority. So we've had that kind of political support, which has been very helpful in trying to implement the chemicals management plan. Of course, that's coming to an end next year, and right now it's an exciting time as we're looking to modernize that and conceive what happens next. I think with chemicals management plans, no matter where you are, it's part of that, I wouldn't say reluctance, but the hesitation is that you have to continue to maintain a regulatory certainty for industry to be able to take their business decisions within the free, open domestic market while still protecting the environment and the human health. So there's certainly that requirement to do our due diligence and ensure that we're constantly improving the systems. We have a lot to learn about, I mean, a lot of improvements that we can make. The chemicals management plan has been very successful and a lot of things worked well, but there's always room for improvement. So we're currently exploring what happens next, and we certainly hope to continue to have that kind of coverage.
And Mike, in the retail context, is there this linking, and in the report cards, is there this linking of the cost of inaction, and how do retailers view that at the same time?
Yeah, no, I think, whenever we can, talk about these issues, not only from a moral perspective and a public health perspective, I think we're much more successful. There's been some really interesting research that has been coming out of, there's this professor in New York City, Dr. Leo Tersande, who some of you may know, who he and his team have put out a number of interesting reports that aim to quantify the costs of treating environmentally induced diseases linked to just a handful of endocrine disrupting chemicals like PBDEs. And I was just looking it up. His team estimated that costs in Europe over $200 billion, in the United States over $340 billion. And this is only the healthcare costs for treating exposure to a handful of chemicals. So I think that the more that we can talk about the true costs of inaction for managing chemicals, I think that the more success we'll have in not only engaging with elected officials, but also decision makers in the C-suite of large companies. I mean, I think there's clear financial, legal, and reputational risks for companies that are not properly managing chemicals of concern in their supply chain. A classic case that we point to in the US is Lumber Liquidators, there was an expose on 60 Minutes in the US, which uncovered that the company was selling formaldehyde-laden flooring at levels that were in violation of certain laws. And the company either knew or should have known that this was an issue. And when this was revealed, there was tons of media coverage. Their stock price plummeted. The CEO was forced to resign. And years later, the company has still not recovered due to the damage that it inflicted on their brand and reputation. Other financial risks that companies face is massive cleanup costs for dealing with legacy pollutants. In the United States, companies that manufactured perfluorinated chemicals, PFAS chemicals, like 3M, DuPont, Chemours are now being sued left and right for having to investigate and pay for cleanup of potentially hazardous sites. There are millions of Americans whose drinking water are contaminated with PFAS chemicals. So when we talk about these issues, I think the more that we can make a clear and strong argument about what are the financial, legal, and reputational risks for companies that are not managing chemicals, I think we can be more successful in really changing the conversation about why we need to act, not only from a public health, but a moral perspective, but making the clear business case. And then also not only talking about it from a negative perspective, but what are the financial opportunities for companies that are getting out in front of these issues? What are the new markets that companies can tap into that are innovative, that are developing the new, safer chemistries of tomorrow, companies that are gaining market share for developing more innovative, safer, healthier, transparent products. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing large US brands like Unilever and P&G and others buying up some of these smaller green brands whose market share is growing exponentially. So I think that we need to be talking about this not only about the financial risks of inaction, but also the financial benefits for companies that are stepping up and meeting this rising consumer demand for healthier and safer and less toxic products.
Great. So yeah, it all folds in together. I think this the concept of cost of inaction and performance measurement, and making sure that you are looking at how effective your chemicals management programs are. So we'd really like to now turn also to the audience. Be great if we had some oral questions or comments as well. So I encourage you to go up to the microphones now, head towards there, and we'll take some of those first before we then turn to the message board. So I see someone heading to the microphone, so if you can introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yep. Hi, Alex Major from Burson Cohen Wolf. My question is maybe more for Elena about the Commission's valuation of chemicals legislation. Is there any information you can share already about the next steps from a practical point of view that the Commission plans to put in place to take that discussion forward? And also how, if at all, that links into the ongoing discussions that followed the REACH review and the actions that have been identified there, and other better regulation initiatives like the fitness check on endocrine disruptors, for example, that's about to start.
On the next steps, well, as I said, we will publish the result of this fitness check in hopefully a couple of weeks. And as we were very eager to discuss the findings, we already planned a high-level conference at the end of June, with the risk that the fitness check would not be published before, but hopefully it will. So the next immediate steps is that we all gather on the 27th and 28th of June and discuss actually the results of the fitness check. And I can already say that the next concrete steps have to be decided by the next Commission, because we are really, I mean, at the end of this legislative cycle, so we cannot enter into clear a recommendation or actions. But for sure, before the new Commission is in place, which will happen in November, we want to have a broad overview of what stakeholders and member states think about the findings, and especially what is their view and their possible objectives for the future. Our idea with this high-level conference is really to put together the findings from this evaluation, but also the REACH evaluation, also the interface on waste products and chemicals, and other evaluations which have been taking place. As I said, I think we have evaluated a lot in the past years, and in my view, we are ready to go to the next stage. Also, the white paper, which actually set up the current approach to chemicals in European policy, dates from 2001. It was a white paper on the future of the EU chemicals policy. I think we could start reflecting on what a future chemicals policy shall be, together with everybody, what shall be our future vision. We had in the meantime a big game changers in the context. There was the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. We had, which relate a lot on chemicals. There are so many SDGs relating to chemicals. We had the Paris Agreement, and of course, climate is now more and more an emergency, and the chemical sector is deeply involved as a solution, but also as a need to decarbonize. But we have also the circular economy, which is more and more a policy priority, not only in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. We are actually having circular economy missions, and the keyword is really spreading everywhere. So we need to see how we move forward to the next step of the EU chemicals policy. How can we help the EU chemicals policy and sector support these different broad objectives? How can we make the interaction functioning better? How can we be maybe more ambitious in terms of some policy goals? So this is what I can say for the next steps.
Okay, great. We'll go to the next question. If there's others that have questions, please come up and go to the mic as well.
Thank you. I have a question to Mike. individual countries for the chemical safety legislations of individual countries, so you can compare them. And off the top of your head, what would be the criteria that you would put into such scorecards? Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, I think that there have been reports that have been published over the years by researchers, for example, at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and the Toxic Use Reduction Institute that have looked at, best-in-class approaches to chemicals management. So I think there's been some interesting reports that already have been published over the years that kind of look at, what are some of the examples of model safer chemical policies that are best in class, that are driving improvements in chemical safety. It's not something that we've thought about doing, but, just off the top of my head, I think questions we'd want to look at include things like, how many chemicals have been assessed for safety, what sort of provision, what sort of results have those laws achieved in terms of driving the reduction or elimination of chemicals of concern out of commerce? How have these laws helped promote innovation and research into green chemistry solutions? How have these laws helped drive air, water, and waste emissions of chemicals of concern down? How have these laws driven reduction in body burden of chemicals of high concern? So, for example, I know in the US, for example, since certain chemicals have been restricted mostly at the state level, we've seen reductions in the body burden for PBD flame retardants in certain populations in the United States. We've seen reduction in the body burden of the phthalate DEHP in certain populations in the United States. So these are, I think some of the questions would be interesting to look at to compare and contrast, different approaches to chemicals management. I think for us, we fought long and hard to advocate for reform of TSCA. Our organization was actually founded about 10 years ago to fight for TSCA reform. And while certainly it was an improvement over existing law, and I think it finally gives the EPA new tools and authority to more adequately manage chemicals of concern. Unfortunately, we don't believe that this administration really has been fulfilling what Congress asked EPA to do when it passed bipartisan reform a couple of years ago. I think that's clearly evident when you look at how EPA has treated methylene chloride, with failing to enact a ban on methylene chloride for workers, which we think is a real travesty when there's been dozens of workers in America that have been killed on the job from working with methylene chloride. I think here in Europe, I think you guys are probably at least a generation ahead of us when it comes to having laws like REACH that manage chemicals. So I know there's a lot of challenges with REACH still, but compared to the United States, I think you guys are doing a much better job than us, sadly. But I think I think that could be an interesting project, perhaps for an agency like OECD or United Nations to take a look at, model chemical policies around the world and what are some of the best-in-class approaches and how can they be further harmonized and aligned together to improve the chemical safety of how chemicals are managed and restricted. So yeah, definitely an interesting idea.
So thumbs up for the idea. Bob, get to work. Next question, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Fer van Broekhuizen, RIVM Bureau REACH. I had a sort of general question. Presented the Mind to Store. Within Europe, we also have initiatives like, for example, the European Eco-Label. And there are often voices that say, well, can't you substitute regulation by voluntary initiatives that are market-driven or so? And I was, we're often toying with this question and seeing how we can do things differently. And I was thinking, what are your ideas of typical problems that, for which voluntary initiatives are are really beneficial and when regulation really needs to come into place?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, I think we're, you know, in the United States, we have a different situation because we have a far less robust and much slower chemical safety evaluation system. I mean, you know, the EPA right now just predominantly looking at 10 chemicals that it's evaluating under TSCA and then a handful of PBTs. And of course, that's going to increase over time. I know as speaker from EPA spoke earlier, now they're, you know, looking at the next 20 chemicals to possibly evaluate, but even under the new law, it is moving very, very slowly. And, you know, we often feel that we can actually make quicker and more substantive progress in the marketplace, but also at the state level. In the United States, you know, we really see states as the laboratories for democracy. You know, we're increasingly seeing states stepping up in the US to go much further than US agencies like EPA, FDA, and CPSC in regulating chemicals. So for example, in the past year, the state of Washington became the first state in the country to restrict and ban PFAS chemicals as a class in firefighting foam and also in food packaging. We're seeing many cities around the country and other state governments beginning to restrict PFAS. And in the marketplace, I mean, we also feel that we can make much quicker change in the marketplace. So as, you know, a couple of examples to call attention to, 3 or 4 years ago, we launched a campaign to challenge US retailers to reduce and eliminate orthophthalates in vinyl flooring, recognizing that flooring is one of the biggest sources of exposure or one of the biggest uses of phthalates in the marketplace. I think at the time accounting for 20 or 30% of all global use. So we ran a campaign encouraging major home improvement retailers to drive phthalates out of flooring. We won a commitment from the Home Depot, and then within a week after that, we won a similar commitment from Lowe's, who is the next biggest home improvement chain. And within a year, we won similar commitments from about 10 to 20 other major retailers of flooring that essentially virtually drove the reduction and elimination of phthalates from vinyl flooring from the US marketplace. And that's, I think, you know, an example of how marketplace strategies can really help, can really drive change sometimes much more quickly and more efficiently than regulation. Certainly, we think that regulation has an incredible role to play, but sometimes when we have administrations like we have now with this Trump EPA that, you know, is fairly resistant to moving a progressive environmental agenda. Another example, 2 years ago under the new TSCA law, the EPA proposed banning trichloroethylene, methylene chloride, and NMP in certain uses. 2 years later, EPA has done little to nothing to move forward enforcing the TCE ban. They've done little to move forward in the ban on NMP and paint removal products. At the same time, on our end, over the past year and a half, we've won commitments from 13 major US home improvement retailers and big box retailers, including Amazon, Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, who have committed to banning the sale of not only methylene chloride, but also NMP at retail, not only for consumers, but also for professional contractors. And now as a result of that, over 30,000 stores across not only the United States, but Canada, Mexico, and other jurisdictions around the world have committed to stop selling paint removal products containing methylene chloride and NMP. And meanwhile, while the US EPA has moved forward in restricting methylene chloride at retail, they've essentially punted on workers. You know, they are now saying that they want to evaluate some sort of training program, which 2 years ago the EPA had already said when they were proposing to restrict methylene chloride, they had concluded that product labeling training would probably not be effective in sufficiently mitigating risks. And you know, as a result of our marketplace engagement work, we've actually been able to win commitments from retailers to not only protect consumers, but also workers from being exposed to these chemicals on the job by banning the sale at retail. So I think that's an example of how we can sometimes make change quicker and more efficiently with some of these marketplace transformation strategies. But again, I think it's somewhat different in the United States because we have a different regulatory regime compared to what you have here in Europe, which we are quite envious of, quite frankly.
All right, so let's move to a couple of the questions on the message board, and if there's some other oral questions, please don't hesitate to come to the microphone. So there's one question about using data from pollution release and transfer registries, so PRTRs, as some of the types of data that could help to measure effectiveness of some of the risk management measures. So maybe either in the EU or in Canada, if you have some, Daren, maybe you'd like to start if you have some, if that's data that's being used.
Sure. Yeah, in Canada, there's a program called the National Pollutant Release Inventory. And although we only got started fairly recently with this type of work, we've already found that data source to be very useful. It's publicly available, in fact, and we've been working with that group to get sector-specific release information as well, and specific geographical information for releases. It's, we agree, very useful source. So the next step, we're going to be working with them moving forward for how to continue to improve on that collaboration between our work. So definitely an important element in performance measurement that we want to build on.
And Elena, maybe, was that a source of information that fed into the refit as well in Europe?
Yeah, that was definitely used, but I cannot tell much, unfortunately, specifically on that. Maybe Mark.
Probably add something. There is an ongoing evaluation of the Industrial Emission Directive here in Europe, and also an evaluation of the EPRTR regulation that implemented the Kiev protocol that established that you need to have a register in the member states, in the countries adhering to the protocol. I've been looking at the data. They are publicly available. That's one of the requirements of the protocol. And indeed, you can observe a decrease in releases for certain pesticides, for example, that are regulated under the Stockholm Convention. You can see that they are still reported in maybe 2 or 3 member states by 2 or 3 industrial facilities, and the real question is that a reporting error, or actually they are releasing a certain amount of these pesticides that have been banned since many, many years. There is a lot of work to be done in terms of the quality of the data.
Right, so it's definitely a data source that can potentially be used, but yeah, maybe the need to improve some of the certainty with that data. See another question? Please go ahead.
So Mark Stavinjeks from KNH. Have a question for Mike. I thought your presentation was really interesting. As more and more substances over here in Europe get banned in different ways, or identified as SVHCs, for example, how much of a concern is there in the States that will trigger class action lawsuits regarding substances containing those substances, if any, in your view? And yeah, if you could comment on that, it'd be really interesting. As a second point, I'd ask, what action has there been from the Commission on monitoring, for example, RAPEX notifications and the number of RAPEX notifications, and whether there's any correlation between the number of substances that are being banned and prohibited and identified as SVHCs with the number of RAPEX notifications coming through? So I guess there are 2 parts.
So yeah, maybe Mike can start, and then Elena, maybe you can, if you're able to comment on the RAPEX part.
Yeah, and just one quick comment that I wanted to make on the previous question of how pollutant registries could be used to track effectiveness of risk management performance. One interesting example, a case study of a positive story, was in the early 2000s in the United States and elsewhere. There was an effort to get arsenic out of treated lumber. There was this effort that was both a policy and a market campaign, and many major manufacturers and retailers and others pledged to phase out arsenic-treated lumber And if you take a look then at databases that are out there, like the Toxic Release Inventory Program, the CDR database, you'll actually see a dramatic drop in uses and releases of arsenic emissions and uses of arsenic in the United States that was really driven by that effort to drive arsenic out of pressure-treated lumber. So that's an example of how that sort of technology or tool can be utilized to track change. But to your question about litigation, certainly we've seen, when when a certain substance gets added to a certain authoritative hazard list or gets added to a certain regulatory risk, certainly I think that there are greater litigation risks that manufacturers, brand owners, retailers face for continuing to sell those products. I mean, I know that Bayer has been facing lots of litigation recently. I think a prime example in the United States is that when substances will get added to the Proposition 65 list of chemicals that are known to the state of California to cause cancer or reproductive harm, there's a whole industry of attorneys, good or bad, depends on your view. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But, there's a whole universe of attorneys who really have made a career of going after companies that may possibly be in violation of Prop 65. So I think that's a really perfect example of how when a chemical is added to an authoritative government regulatory program, how that can really help drive litigation. And I think that's why it's really important for companies and the business community to really keep track of and manage when chemicals get added to these authoritative government regulatory or hazard lists.
And Elena, if you can reflect on the question on the RAPEX.
Yeah, on RAPEX and generally on surveillance data, basically our conclusion was that this data cannot be really used as an indicator on the level of compliance. This is for sure a major data gap that we have, and it depends a lot on the resources of the member states. So there is a very different level of how much member states are actually investing in surveillance activity. So I wouldn't know exactly what to answer on the correlation data, but for sure this is not a sample. It just addresses the tip of the iceberg and the most, let's say, the easiest cases to identify.
We have another question here.
Yes. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Also zooming in a bit on the sort of the consumer angle and going, I think, back to Mike, but maybe also to Elena. By the way, my name is Willem Vriesendorp with FIPRA. I was actually triggered by something we were discussing over lunch as well, and that is the socio-economic assessment. How do you see a sort of a more prominent role for consumers or for citizens in that system? And if so, how could they be more emancipated into that system? I think a question to you, Mike, and Elena, maybe you as well, Eva, but that would be super interesting. Thanks.
Can you restate the question? I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, as I understand it is, so if there's socioeconomic assessment that's done to support performance measurement, is there a way for the public to be more involved in providing input to that socioeconomic assessment?
Yeah, I think socioeconomic assessments are really, where you get, where regulation really tries to capture what society thinks or finds valuable, right? So how does that, and how can it be sort of further enforced or further emancipated, where you get a better view of what people actually find and what they value, what they find important? How can, is there some, I tried to be a bit creative here, but you triggered me a little bit with your ranking systematics. Is there something, and maybe also picking up on the question of Bob, is there something also that we can use that better into our own legislation? Can we get better a consumer view integrated into that?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, and I'll attempt to answer it, although I might have slightly different response, which is perspective, which is, one of the reasons why we, with the Mind the Story campaign, has focused on the US retail sector is because really retailers are at the front lines of consumer discontent when it comes to product safety. When you're going shopping, you're not thinking of who are the companies that make these products further upstream, in terms of chemicals, the Dows, the DuPonts, the Chemours, the BASFs of the world. But consumers have really intimate relationships with the retailers that they shop at. They have strong brand relationship that has been developed, due to years of, sophisticated, and I would say somewhat creepy advertising campaigns. But so for us, we really aim to harness that relationship between the consumer and the brands and the retailers that they shop at to encourage companies to be more socially responsible and environmentally responsible. The companies really care what their customers think about. I mean, we hear time and time again, if you talk to Walmart about why did they launch the Safer Chemicals policy 6 years ago, it wasn't just because the Mind the Store campaign and EDF were asking them to do that, but it's because they're hearing from their customers. The customer, she wants to know whether or not that shampoo or that baby bottle is safe or healthy for them. And they don't want to be told that a little bit of formaldehyde or a little bit of a, DHP phthalate is not going to make them sick. So for the campaign, we really aim to harness that relationship that consumers have with the brands and the retailers that they shop at, and then we try to transform that and harness that consumer pressure and power to hold corporations accountable and encourage them to improve. In many cases, we aim to, and we often will work with companies behind the scenes and identify ways in which they could be more responsible corporate citizens. But in cases where companies are not really playing so nicely and willing to do the right thing, we also will launch more public-facing campaigns to hold companies accountable. And then when we are successful there, then encourage their competitors to follow suit. We often will do a lot of testing to see what sort of messages and issues resonate with our base online, through our email list, through social media. And we've definitely learned a lot about what are the issues that folks in our community care about, and that has really also driven the issues and the campaigns that we've focused on in recent years. So for example, chemicals in food packaging and food additives, that's an example of an area where there's a lot of concern, and that's why over the years we've focused our campaigns on certain chemicals like BPA and PFAS and phthalates in food contact materials. So for the issues that consumers care about really inform and help drive the work that we do, as well as what the scientific research, peer-reviewed literature says about chemicals of concern and the possible health hazards and risks that consumers, communities, and workers face when producing and disposing of these materials and products.
And so we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but Elena, if you can just provide some reflection on, in terms of the socioeconomic analysis under your policy evaluations, is the consumer, you see the consumer view is incorporated in there through the willingness to pay aspect, or some thoughts on that, just briefly, if you can.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, as I said, the Better Regulation Program foresees that many views are taken into account. So there was a Eurobarometer consultation to take into account really the citizens' perspective. We know that chemicals are not easily understood by citizens. So that's why there was also a public consultation where normally you have stakeholders really contributing more than average citizens. And there were also many experts workshops. What we tried to do was really to try to clarify what the different perspectives were. And this is something we definitely want to build on and also discuss when we will start our further steps and discussion on the next steps. So we have also invited, for example, the consumers associations to come to our conference end of June. But what I wanted to say about citizens is also that one aspect that came out also quite prominently during our evaluation was that of communication of hazards to citizens. And on this, I think we can do more. So it was quite clear that also from the Eurobarometer that hazards are not so well understood through, for example, our pictograms or that can be communicated better. So probably one area to explore would be to try to identify ways to better communicate hazard information to citizens, also exploiting, for example, digital tools, QR codes, and these kind of things, which for the moment, I think in Europe are quite unexplored.
So it's time for our panel to wrap up. So I hope with the discussion here today, we've given you more of a flavor of performance measurement and why it is important to have performance measurement both within government chemical management programs, but also within retail and other sectors, as there's different players that are all responsible for chemicals management, and tracking how we're doing is important. So that we make sure that we're actually making a difference and reaching the goals of the chemical management programs that are in place. But then you've also heard about the number of challenges with this, and also data that's needed to be able to do this better. But just going forward and improving these performance measurement areas and actually trying to do the performance measurement, we've heard also sort of stimulates availability of this data at the same time. So if you can all please join me in thanking the panelists today for their contributions and ideas, and thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you, Eeva, and the panelists indeed. And it's now time to wrap up the day. It's been a long day, and we've lost a lot of people along the line. But I wouldn't want to let you go without the wise words of Yuka Mom. He will close today with his summary of the day. And from my experience, he has a keen eye and a keen ear. So, Yuka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon also from my side. Indeed, again, some concluding remarks following the order of the session, starting with the panel 1 about how to choose the best risk management option. For me, the key issues for discussions were around the very issue of how to actually pick up the best risk management option among the various options. And even though the discussion was quite much focusing on the actual chemicals management tools, it was also showing that beyond those, in the surrounding sectoral legislation, like worker protection, environmental legislation, there are also options that can and should be considered. Starting from our context, REACH regulation, if there's a restriction proposed, there are certain criteria that has to be looked at in terms of choosing that option, and these include effectiveness, practicability, and monitorability. These were reflected in the discussion, even though not perhaps explicitly listed. But then I also heard other a bit supplementary, complementary criteria about proportionality, consistency within chemicals legislation, but also beyond. For example, in reference to CO2 emissions or circular economy indeed, the issues related to cost and benefits and economic consequences. Identifying the best option is a combination of partly technical and scientific information, coming from the risk assessment, but also then going beyond dealing with the uncertainties of the information, and at the end it is very much about policy judgment and includes trade-offs. And one important question there that we've been struggling ourselves and working on from the very beginning doing the risk management option analysis is what is a fit for purpose analysis, how to avoid paralysis by analysis, but how to find the best balance in being able to move forward with limited information. So what is the right level of scrutiny and to inform the next step of the decision making. Obviously, for all stakeholders, all actors involved, transparency and predictability are important elements, as is the engagement of all relevant actors, including the challenging element of how to actually activate competitors to give information about substitutes and alternatives. It was clearly mentioned that in the EU especially the authorization mechanism and the restrictions are strong drivers for substitution. That was also concluded by the REACH review, but also there are other drivers and we see the effects of those already, including regulatory and non-regulatory drivers. I noted some opportunities, so I think we all are learning by doing, and while benefits are already seeable, there are improvements that are needed in the process, and both us authorities and also industry and other stakeholders are learning. In terms of, well, the discussion was quite much focusing on EU, but there was, of course, also the US aspect and some other non-EU aspects in the discussion. And even though the legal systems are somewhat different, there are also a lot of common ground between the countries in terms of identifying need for risk management and also the approach for risk management. Especially there's overlap on substances under focus, and also there's probably common interest and common information to be shared about uses of substances, their risks and alternatives, etc. One theme for me always is how to actually promote proactive substitution by industry, especially instead of reacting to what the authorities are putting forward. An important element was how to increase understanding of the public of the risk management and including socioeconomic analysis. And last but not least, also related to what we heard partly in the last panel, was what Daniel Calleja was explaining in his introduction this morning, that the Commission is looking forward for chemicals policy, and in that also how to better integrate not only the risk management within the chemicals management system, but also beyond in the surrounding legislation, and how to move towards more integrated and systemic approach, if you like, chemicals management 3.0, if the current REACH is kind of a 2.0 in the EU context. Moving to the grouping, I think quite obviously grouping is there to improve efficiency and consistency, and on one hand it has been applied for a long time, but in a bit of a sort of patchy way, separately in different steps of the process, different aspects. And as you heard, also we in ECHA, we are moving towards more coherent and perhaps wider coverage of the grouping, doing the grouping across processes and not only step by step. And even though the context, grouping is always context dependent, and even though there are some differences in the practical ways of doing it, it's quite much based on still similar approaches, at least among the OECD, active OECD countries. It was clear that it's very important to acknowledge for which purpose the grouping is made and which phase of the process it applies for, and whether it's serving indeed priority setting, filling data gaps, or risk management. And also the focus there on for the grouping may vary, so it may be based on structure of the substances, the mode of action, the hazard or the use and function. And again, a bit similar to the previous panel, the issue of how to find a fit-for-purpose analysis and the right level of scrutiny is relevant as here. Opportunities, we and others are continuously improving and working to improve the database to have better information about especially the hazardous properties of chemicals, and this then provides improved possibilities also for authorities for more informed basis for the grouping, but also it provides opportunities for industry to benefit from that data, and again for us to inform and for industry to learn from the unwanted properties of chemicals. And this all can also help moving from regrettable to informed substitution. There was a question of is there a need for international cooperation in the form of standardization or validation, which was regarded as premature clearly, but then at the same time there could be room for sharing experiences about the approaches, best practice, and simply sharing the information to avoid double work and to learn from others. And then the third panel about performance management of the chemicals systems. Clearly the key issue is what to measure, and there, as we heard, there are two main dimensions. One is to what extent you focus on the actual input and output of the systems, to what extent you focus on certain activities, certain outcomes or results, and to what extent you are able to focus on the actual final impact. And that is the very reason the systems are there. And that's one level. The other level is to what extent you work based on indicators, and the role of the indicators is to indicate something versus how much you are able to do actually definite in-depth assessments. And I think the balance between the two and the abilities even to apply the two were very much in the heart of the discussion. Again, as I think many times noted, it is easier to monitor costs than benefits, and there were a lot of specific challenges for this area mentioned in the discussion, including how to establish the causal link of what we do with what actually happens in the environment or in the population. The number of substances on the market, so you cannot monitor in detail everything. We have still the lack of data even to know what to monitor, and other aspects as mentioned in the discussion. And I think very importantly, also somebody was mentioning the importance of transparency about the assumptions and uncertainties in the assessment, as I think in all of work that we are doing. And then finally, opportunities. I think here the perfection is not that we should be striving at. We should be working based on partial data and combination of different dimensions, because that actually helps seeing trends and impacts. Also, case studies can be helpful. For example, we have done, of course, in relation to individual restrictions, for example, always a socioeconomic analysis, and putting those together and drawing conclusion based on individual cases helps seeing bigger picture. Assessing cost of inaction is always important aspect to remember. At the same time, the methodology for socioeconomic analysis is progressing, and that may give us better basis for the future, also for the analysis at systemic level. We heard positive news about that some businesses are setting up chemicals policies, which again may help also in the monitoring of the successfulness of these policies. And we may be able to learn from other policy sectors, however, keeping in mind the specific challenges of the chemicals sector. So that is what I learned from the discussion. I hope you also learned a lot, and with that I conclude my conclusions, and thank you.
Thank you, Jukka. And this concludes the first day. But before I let you go, I have some remarks to make on what we're going to do tonight. We will have dinner at the ODI. That's a fantastic new library great architecture. So I hope you can join us there. And the dinner will be hosted by the city of Helsinki and by the mayor. The dinner starts at 8 o'clock, and we'll leave here collectively at 7, the lobby of the hotel, to take public transport into town. It's only 15 minutes, but you know, it will make it easier for you to get into town. It's and otherwise, you know, you can always take a taxi or Uber or whatever. Please take this one with you, otherwise you will not get in. You got this in the morning with your registration. Don't forget it. And then tomorrow morning, we'll start again at 9 a.m. sharp, and I hope to see you all again. Coffee will be served from 8 o'clock onwards, and then we'll have another exciting day. Thank you very much for your contributions today, and see you tonight. Thank you.